Hello, everybody. This is the lecture on single subject designs. This is going to be a relatively brief, for sure less than an hour. It might even be significantly less than that. A lot of this material is straightforward, and also given that you can rewind and rewind, I guess rewind we can call it. You can go backwards and listen to this several times. I'll try to keep this at a decent pace. And basically, the big issue here is what's your focus of research? Is it nomothetic or is it idiographic? So nomothetic research is what we typically talk about in psychology classes. Nomothetic just means that you're doing group level analyses. So you're looking at a sample, you're looking at groups, and you're making interpretations about groups. In terms of idiographic is about individuals. So what can we say about individuals? And so typically research in psychology is nomothetic, but this sort of single subject designs is more idiographic. So with these single subject designs, there's typically 10 or less participants, but this does not include the case study. So the textbook is pretty adamant that single subject design does not mean a case study. That's mainly qualitative and a thick and rich description about some one thing, whether it's a person or a group or a classroom or a organization. And so the single subject designs are typically 10 or less people in your study. Nomothetic, typically we have 20 or more, so we want the power and the sample sizes to do our analyses, and so nomothetic usually has 20 or more people. And typically single subjects designs are used in applied areas or to answer applied questions. Why is that? Because a lot of the single subjects design that the textbook talks about are trying to focus in on how individuals are impacted by certain interventions or treatments. And definitely there is also research that's out there that wants to look at how things are actually happening in the flesh, if you will. And so there has been a movement for some decades, and I don't know how much it's advanced, but there's been a movement, for example, in personality research, that if you definitely do your nomothetic research and you find patterns in groups. However, there's some journals that have wanted to also have idiographic description about how those things are seen in a real person. So that we call it on the hoof. And so if you're talking about that there's relationships among variables and there's various processes connecting those variables, you should be able to explain how it's actually seen in real live individual people. So I think single subject research is also trying to get at that level of description. And the difference between single subject research design and case studies is that single subject research designs are emphasizing experimental manipulation and control. They're emphasizing quantitative data, whereas case studies often there's a more qualitative data, and so-called objective interpretations and measures. I put that in quotes because I think the use of the word objective is perhaps misused, and perhaps there's some academic elitism in its use. But certainly the experimental manipulation and control and the quantitative aspects are the key ingredients to a single subject research design versus case study. So your book talks about assumptions, and these assumptions are kind of why do you do this type of research? So obviously, since your sample's smaller in single subject designs, you're able to focus more intensively on individuals. So if you have 10 people or less, you can really focus a lot more on those individual people versus bigger studies with larger groups of people. And why do we do this? Well, sometimes people do this because they understand that nomothetic research, group level analyses sometimes cover up individual differences. And so this single subject research is often done to illustrate and to explain those individual differences. So the book talks about another example that you can look at, but thinking of an example about that there's different effects of the IV on different individuals. I'm just thinking about ego threat. Ego threat is basically, let's say it's an experiment. You come into the experiment and there's this thing called false feedback, and somebody. One condition is that there's no ego threat, and people just say, "Oh, you did 80 out of 100. That's good." There's no ego threat there. If you're in the ego threat condition, somebody will say, "Oh my gosh, you got 20 out of 100. This is like the lowest score possible. Only less than 1% of people get this low of a score." So it's giving you false feedback saying you're stupid. And so it's ego threat. And so, the research indicates that people's reaction to ego threat depends on whether you are high on narcissism or low on narcissism. If you're low on narcissism, you're probably feeling depressed. At least people can see you're depressed. You show depression and sadness with given false feedback that you're stupid. People who are high on narcissism, if you give them false feedback that they're stupid, they can get very angry and aggressive. And so that's just an example. So if I was studying ego threat and I wanted to do single subjects research, I might want to uncover those individual differences of people who are high on narcissism versus low on narcissism. Whereas if I just did a group study, those two groups very likely would cancel each other out, and there'd be no effect that you would see there. And the book talks about, again, because single subjects research is often has an applied focus, a real world problem. You might want to do this research if you're curious about certain types of people. So a good example might be at-risk kids. So you might want to focus on kids who are at risk in the classroom, and there might only be 2 or 3 in each classroom, but you want to focus on them. You don't care about the other kids in the sense that you want to focus on the at-risk kids. And vice versa, you might be curious about gifted kids, so you would select 2 or 3 kids who are gifted. You wouldn't look at the whole class, you would just look at those kids who are gifted. So it depends on your question and your basically there's 2 things here. There's one is that you want to describe individual differences that might get covered up in group research. And then there's this idea that a lot of this single subject research is applied. You're curious about an applied real world problem, and given that you are more selective in who your participants are, you just don't grab everybody. You select certain people that you feel would benefit the most from your intervention. Another assumption or why you would do this type of research is you want to discover a causal relationship. So remember that the big difference between a case study and single subject research designs is that single subject research designs actually try to do experimental methodology. So you have manipulation of an IV and experimental control. Given this, you are hoping to uncover some sort of causal relationship. Typically, if it's a real world problem, that the causal relationship you hope to find is that the intervention that you think impacts people actually does impact people positively. And then another thing about assumptions, another assumption or why you would do this type of research is there's some stuff there that you believe is there's some strong and consistent effect that you can uncover, and it has some sort of biological or social importance. So the book talks about this as social validity. So again, it's this real world problems. So you're seeing here that real world focus is a big reason why people do single subjects research. And do look in your textbook for examples of this type of research. So there's some general features that are true across different designs in the single subject methodologies. These general features that apply to all single subject designs is that the dependent variable is measured repeatedly over time at regular intervals. And we're going to see a graph that illustrates these three things in a second. And the study is divided into distinct phases. So phases are like a length of time, roughly, with one condition or level of the IV in each phase. And then it's basically, you consider a within subjects design. So you're changing conditions or levels, and you change that based on the participant's behavior. You don't say, I'm going to measure the DV in this phase for a week, and then I'll do the next thing for a week. You don't do that. You do it when essentially the behavior becomes consistent. And so if you do a phase, you do some sort of change in your IV, it's typically an intervention, or you withdraw the intervention. People will change a bit, and there might be a little bit of bouncing around. But then once you see there's kind of more of a tight line, things are becoming more consistent in terms of the dependent variable, then you switch. Then you switch the conditions. Why do we do it this way? Well, for one, you don't need to measure that dependent variable anymore under that condition, because you have consistency. If it's consistent, why keep on doing it? You already have a pretty stable line. There's no reason to waste time and just keep on repeating that if it looks like it's pretty consistent. And then the other reason is it makes it more sensitive to change to the next level. So we want some consistency, so that we don't want the line bouncing and then change it, because we look at the change in the next phase, and we might not be able to interpret it because it might just look more bouncy. So you get this bouncing line, and then you change it, and you have a bouncing line again, and there's no way to interpret that. So you want kind of a consistent, more straight line, and then you make the change to the next phase. You change the level of the IV. Then you look to see if, from that consistent line, if the DV goes up or down. So it makes it more, that's being sensitive to change. You'll be able to measure and identify change if you have a more consistent line right before you make that change. So let's look at a graphical example of these features. So remember that the first feature is the DVs measure regularly over time at regular intervals. So here's our dependent variable. Here's time. So you can see that we're measuring that dependent variable pretty consistently. So there's different phases. I need to think a little bit about this. There's different phases. So here, A and B are the different levels. So here there's just two levels. So we have an A level. I'm assuming this might be almost like a control condition, but I can't say for sure. I'm guessing it's probably control. A is control condition. B, you make some sort of intervention. And then A, you go back to the control. So you actually withdraw the intervention in B, and you go back to the control phase. And so there's different phases. And then the final thing we mentioned in the previous slide is that we switch the phases, not based on time, but based on when we get a consistent level. So usually it's a little bit more like this. It's not like a straight line. So you can see there's quite a bit of bouncing right here early on in the A condition, but then things get to be a little bit more stable. In fact, there's 3 of the last 5 readings are exactly on the same level. So we could say that things have become more consistent here. So the behaviors become more consistent. There's more of a straight line. There's less variability. There's more variability here. People are adjusting. So there's more consistency here. Consistency, shift the level of your independent variable. So you shift the level, and then you see the big bounce here. So if we did it here, if we switch to B here, and we just have this change, we wouldn't be able to pick up that change due to B. But we can actually see it now quite well because the line is consistently here, and then there's a big bounce upwards. And then you can see there's some adjustment by the people. There's a little bit of bouncing, and then it gets to be a little bit more consistent here. And then you shift the phase again, which is, I think, a withdrawal of that intervention to the control condition again. And then you see that big shift. You see a shift down, and then you see it's relatively consistent here. So you do that shifting when there's consistency, so you can see these changes much better. It's much more sensitive to the change about A to B, B to A. And I'd say that this is pretty good evidence that B made an impact on a dependent variable. It's up here. And then once we withdrew that, there's a big drop, and then there was a little bit of adjustment, but in general, people still were around here, which is kind of where they were around here. So it's a good evidence that B made an impact on that behavior. And what we're showing in that graph actually is the reversal design. In this case, it's called an ABA if we have two levels. One level is A, the other level is B, and I'm guessing that this is control A, and B is the treatment condition. And so we measure people before we do the treatment. Then we do the treatment and see how people change. Then we withdraw, we reverse, we take away the treatment, and then see if people go back to this previous level. And so it's called an ABA design if it has two levels, but you can have more levels. So, you can have the ABC, BA design. So the book talks a little bit more about that. I'm not going to get into having you be able to put letters to those things. What I want you to understand is, what are you doing in reversal? You're having a control condition before you give the treatment. You give the treatment, and then you withdraw the treatment. So you're reversing the levels of the IV. And this is another example. So they call it a baseline, but baseline is just simply control. So if you're calling it a baseline, it's control. You haven't done your intervention yet. So here we have, I guess, tutorial sessions, we can call it. It could be class sessions, but some sort of tutorial session perhaps. And there's a % of time studying, and there's a baseline where it's just business as usual. And then there's things about positive attention, which I assume is something like, hey, it's really great you're studying. Hopefully it's a little bit more natural than that, but there's some positive attention that the person's getting when they're studying. And so this is A, this is B, this is A, and this is B. And to me, this looks like there's some good evidence. So this time studying is not that great to start with. It goes up quite a bit with the attention. There's a little bit of benefit here. It looks like even when you withdraw the attention, people still are studying, but they're starting to slip a little bit right here. And then once you give them positive attention, people say, well, are you really paying attention to me? And then there's a bounce back up. So this to me seems like good evidence that positive attention does affect a % of time studying. And again, you can see the phases are not equal here. So the number of sessions are not equal because they're choosing when to switch levels of the IV based on whether there's a leveling out of the behavior time studying. Once there's a leveling out, you change and see if there is a detectable difference. So a problem with these reversal designs is a big one, and I think I mentioned this in the previous lecture, is that it definitely can be unethical because let's say it's a treatment and people are benefiting from that treatment. Is it really ethical to withdraw it just because you want to do a a nice little research design and publish it? I'd say no. You should not do that. It would be unethical. Also, there might be confounds possibly with the reversal design. Um, with this ABA, there could be a possible confound of like history, something's happening. This design's a little bit better because the chances that something happened here and something happened here to drive that behavior up is less likely than something happened here to drive this behavior up. Still, there are some confounds in reversal designs. So your book talks about multiple baseline designs. And the one I want to sort of talk about most, you can review the other ones in the textbook, but this one to me makes the most sense, is across participants. So multiple baseline designs. And so your book is nice, but one of the things that I don't like is they throw all of these graphs in together. It's hard to see. But let's just say that we have 6 people in our single subjects research design. You can see that we have different baselines here that we expose people to. And so we could set up our study so that 2 people in our study have this type of a baseline. That we're going to measure them this long, and then we're going to do the treatment, and then we'll see what happens. This other one, we'll let this baseline measurement go longer for 2 other people, and then we'll do the treatment. And then for 2 other people, we're going to have the baseline go much longer before we actually do the treatment. And why you do this is that you're curious. For one, obviously, you want to see that there is this drop. I assume that this is some sort of negative behavior, or maladaptive behavior is a better word for it. So there's a higher level of maladaptive behavior. The treatment happens, it drops. For these 2 people, you're measuring it for a longer time. In the control condition, you treat it, it drops. For these people, you measure the baseline longer, you treat it, it drops. So there's a consistent drop, regardless of whether you do it early or in the middle or later in this time span that you're doing your study. So there's that benefit. And also it rules out various confounds. So if there's a confound of history, it's even though if you have one group, maybe something happened, some event happened to the school, let's say, and this changed people's behavior. Well, it's unlikely that some event happened and drove people's behavior down in this period of time, and also an event happened here that drove down the behavior, and an event happened here that drove down the behavior. So the possibility of history having an impact on this is very unlikely because there'd have to be 3 different events happening exactly at these times to change the behavior, and that's not very likely. Also, it controls for things like maturation. So if this is a relatively long study, if maturation is an issue, then this behavior would go down for everybody. So you'd see the behavior go down before treatment here and go down before treatment here. So if there was something about maturation, it would show up. There'd be changes before the treatment happened for these groups that had later treatment. So this design where you have multiple baselines allows you to control for those different confounds. So it can be a pretty powerful design. And then pretty much the last part is I'll have you read the textbook. The last section talks about the debate between nomothetic or group level research and ideographic, for example, single subject research design. So do read that in your textbook. So one of the things that I like in your textbook, it talks about converging evidence. So we've been talking about this quite a bit in class. And so basically, if some researchers take a nomothetic group level approach and some take a single subjects ideographic approach, and if the findings from those studies sing the same songs, say the same things are going on, and then we have a lot of evidence for our hypothesis, for our explanations about what's going on, because we are able to see it in both those approaches to research. So that's converging evidence. You're having different methodologies, but it's saying the same stuff. That's very strong evidence. Again, see the debate in the textbook. And a big thing about this when we're talking about nomothetic group level versus idiographic single subjects level is that just like the different methodologies we talked about in class, the self-report, observer reports, informants, the archival data, the test or task data, just like those methodologies, these broader approaches to research, nomothetic versus idiographic, each of these approaches has its advantages and disadvantages. And so what's nice in the converging evidence argument is that you complement each other's approaches that way. So you lean on your advantages, and in some ways you make up for the disadvantages of the other approach, and vice versa. The other approach makes up for your disadvantages of your approach. And basically the key point here is that each methodology, when we're talking about the self-report versus observer versus informant, etc., and also this nomothetic versus idiographic general approach to research. Each of these methods and each of these approaches, general approaches, have different affordances. What are affordances? Affordances means that there's something unique that approach or methodology tells us about people. So we want researchers to use different methodologies and different approaches because each of those methodologies, each of those approaches tells us something unique about what it's like to be a person. And so we can get a broader, deeper, more fuller understanding of people when we use different methodologies with different affordances, because we're learning about different pieces about people in general. So do read that last part of your textbook. I think it's an interesting thing to take away from this course. And that's it. So I think that was a relatively concise lecture. And if you have any questions, this week, the week of the 13th, we are going to have 2 live Q&A sessions. And I think I'm going to make that 2 live Q&A sessions, and I'll have the exam start after the Q&A sessions. So join the Q&A sessions if you have any questions. Otherwise, good luck on the exam. There is one short lecture after this that will also be included on the exam.